There's a woman in Japan who has been sitting in the same apartment for 11 years, surrounded by her ex-husband's belongings. He left. She stayed. And she genuinely cannot bring herself to move a single box. Now, before you think that's extreme, I want you to think about something in your own life, a relationship you stayed in too long, a job that was slowly draining you, a grudge you're still holding against someone who has probably forgotten your name, a version of yourself that you keep trying to go back to. Why do we do that? Because here's what nobody tells you: letting go isn't a choice your brain naturally supports. In fact, your mind is literally wired at a neurological level to hold on. And once you understand how that mechanism actually works, you'll never look at your own patterns the same way again. So let's talk about what's really happening inside your head and why it's not weakness, it's biology. Let's start with something that sounds counterintuitive. Your brain does not experience loss the same way it experiences gain. Not even close. Research from Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist who won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, and his colleague Amos Tversky showed that losing something feels psychologically about twice as painful as gaining the equivalent thing feels good. Lose $20, that sting? It's roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of finding $20 on the sidewalk. This is called loss aversion, and it's not a personality quirk, it's a feature. Think about what that actually means in your daily life. It means that every time you consider walking away from something, a relationship, a career, a belief about yourself, your brain is running a calculation that is inherently biased against leaving. The potential gain of something better doesn't feel nearly as real or as urgent as the fear of losing what you already have, even if what you already have is making you miserable. But here's where it gets interesting, because loss aversion is only part of the story. There's another force at work, and it has everything to do with dopamine. In 2023, researchers at Stanford University published a study in the journal Neuron that identified something remarkable about the sunk cost fallacy, the well-known tendency to keep investing in something just because you've already put time or money into it. You know the feeling. You're an hour into a terrible movie, and you stay because you already paid for it. You're 3 years into the wrong career, and you don't leave because you've already given it so much. That's the sunk cost fallacy in action. But why does it happen? What's the actual mechanism? The Stanford team, working with mice, found that dopamine release in a brain region called the striatum is heavily influenced by the effort put into gaining a reward. The more the animal worked for something, the more dopamine the brain released in connection with it. The researchers themselves noted this could be the neural basis for the sunk cost effect in humans. In other words, based on what we know about how dopamine shapes motivation and behavior across mammals, it's reasonable to infer that something similar is at work in us, that our brains chemically encode the value of what we've invested. It doesn't just remember the effort, it makes the thing feel worth more because of it. You're not being irrational when you can't let go of the job you've poured 5 years into. Your brain may have literally revalued it based on what you sacrificed. That's not weakness. That's your dopamine system doing exactly what it evolved to do. And yet, it can trap you completely. Now let's talk about the part of your brain that might be the most underestimated player in all of this. When you're not actively focused on something, when you're in the shower, lying in bed at night, staring out a car window, your brain doesn't go quiet. A network of regions called the default mode network kicks in. Neuroscientists used to call this the brain's resting state, but that name is deeply misleading because this network isn't resting, it's working overtime. The default mode network is your brain's internal storyteller. It reconstructs the past, it simulates the future, and most critically, it constructs your sense of self, the ongoing narrative of who you are, where you've been, and what it all means is being written and rewritten constantly by this network. Here's why that matters. When you go through something painful, a breakup, a failure, a loss, the DMN gets involved. And for many people, especially those dealing with grief or depression, the DMN doesn't just process the experience and move on. It loops. Research published in the journal Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience in 2023 found that people at risk for depression show increased activation in DMN regions, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex, when processing negative self-referential information. The brain keeps returning to the wound. This is called rumination, and it's not the same as reflection. Reflection is, what happened? What did I learn? What do I do next? Rumination is, why did this happen to me? What's wrong with me? What if I'd done something different? On repeat, for hours. sometimes years. And here's the cruel irony. The DMN is the same network that holds your identity. So when you ruminate about a failed relationship or a lost opportunity, your brain isn't just replaying an event. Given that self-construction and rumination both run through the same network, it follows that the memory and the self can start to become entangled, which would help explain precisely why letting go of certain experiences feels less like releasing a moment in time and more like losing a piece of who you are. It's not that you can't move on. It's that your brain may have woven the painful experience so deeply into its ongoing story that the prospect of releasing it feels like erasing something essential. Think about the heaviest thing you're carrying right now. Maybe it's a version of yourself you haven't been for years, the person you were before things went wrong. Maybe it's a relationship that ended badly and you keep replaying the conversation where everything fell apart. Maybe it's a choice you made that you'd give almost anything to take back. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of your present life is being shaped by that thing you can't put down? Because here's what the research on grief and trauma tells us. The problem isn't usually that people don't want to move forward. Most people desperately want to. The problem is that they don't understand what they're actually holding onto or why. There's a concept in psychology called narrative identity, developed by psychologist Dan McAdams, that we each carry an internalized, evolving story of ourselves, who we are, where we've come from, what our life means. And according to this framework, certain experiences don't just happen to us. They get written into that story as defining chapters. The person who stayed in a difficult marriage for 20 years isn't just leaving a relationship if they walk away. They're potentially rewriting a central chapter of who they understand themselves to be. The person who has carried a story of failure for a decade isn't just changing a belief when they let it go. They're revising the narrative their entire sense of self has been built around. This is why willpower alone almost never works when it comes to deep letting go. You can't just decide to stop caring about something that your brain has embedded in its architecture. Telling someone who is stuck to just move on is a bit like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. The advice isn't wrong exactly. It just misses the actual problem entirely. The actual problem is structural, and structural problems require structural solutions. Here's another piece of this puzzle that rarely gets talked about. A lot of the time, people don't hold on because they love what they're holding. They hold on because they're terrified of what exists on the other side of letting go. Think about it. Letting go creates a gap, and the human brain, by design, resists gaps. We are pattern-seeking, certainty-craving creatures. The brain's limbic system, the part most closely associated with emotional processing and threat detection, appears to weight familiar patterns as less threatening, even when those patterns are painful. A toxic relationship is at least a known toxic relationship. A painful identity is at least a familiar identity. The unknown, that's where the real fear lies. Psychologists who study avoidance behavior have pointed out something counterintuitive. It's often not the thing being released that frightens people. It's the uncertainty of what comes next. The discomfort of emptiness. Of not knowing what comes next. Of having to build something without a blueprint. And so, in a way that psychologists recognize as motivated reasoning, the brain generates reasons to stay. It finds new justifications for the old attachment. It reframes the painful thing as comfortable. It whispers, but what if things get better? But what about everything we've built? But who are you without this? This is not logic. This is the brain's threat response system protecting you from uncertainty by keeping you in a cage you've at least memorized. Understanding this changes something important. Because if the real fear isn't about what you're leaving, it's about what you're walking toward, then the question shifts. Instead of asking, how do I let go, the more useful question becomes, what do I actually want to walk toward? That reframe is not just philosophical, it may be neurological. Based on what we know about how the brain's systems work, moving towards something new likely engages different circuitry than the backward-pulling loops of rumination. You're not escaping, you're navigating. And that appears to be a fundamentally different experience for the brain. So what do you actually do with all of this? First, and this might sound strange, you stop trying to force it. The research on neuroplasticity is clear. The brain is not fixed. It can change its physical structure and the patterns it runs on. But change happens gradually, and it happens through new experience, not through sheer determination. Every time you genuinely engage with something new, a new relationship, a new skill, a new way of thinking about yourself, you are building new neural pathways. The old ones don't vanish overnight, but based on what we understand about how memory and habit consolidation work, they do tend to weaken when they stop being reinforced. This is why distraction without intention doesn't work. Staying busy doesn't rewire the brain. Genuine engagement with something new does. Second, and this is critical, you name what you're actually feeling. Not overwhelmed, not frustrated. Something precise. Grief, fear, shame, longing. The limbic system processes emotions differently when they're accurately labeled. Research suggests that the act of naming an emotion with precision reduces its intensity. Neuroscientists call it affect labeling. Your brain processes a labeled emotion as something known, something categorized, and therefore something less threatening. What you can name, you can begin to navigate. Third, you grieve properly, not performatively, not efficiently, properly. Because grief is not the sign that something has gone wrong in the healing process. Grief is the process. Research on bereavement and neuroplasticity suggests the brain needs time to reorganize itself around a new reality, to literally update the models it has built around the person or thing that's gone. Trying to rush that is like pulling a plant out of the ground and expecting it to grow faster somewhere else immediately. And finally, this is the thing nobody wants to hear, but it's backed by everything we know about how the brain works. You have to be willing to tolerate the empty space. The gap that exists after you release something is not a sign of failure. It's the necessary precondition for anything new to grow. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. The next time you catch yourself clinging to something, a memory, a relationship, a version of yourself that no longer fits, don't call it weakness. Don't tell yourself you're broken for not being able to just move on. What you're experiencing is the result of a brain that was built to attach, to protect, to preserve. Loss aversion, dopamine encoding, the default mode network writing you into its story. These are not flaws. They are features of an extraordinarily complex system that evolved to keep you alive and connected. But they can also keep you stuck. And the difference between someone who stays stuck and someone who eventually moves forward isn't willpower. It isn't strength. It's understanding. It's knowing why the brain holds on, and then slowly, patiently, giving it a reason to loosen its grip. The woman in that apartment in Japan eventually moved, not because she forced herself, but because one day she allowed herself to imagine, just briefly, what her life might look like if she did. That one small act of imagination was enough. Your brain is not your enemy, it's just telling a very old story. Maybe it's time to write a new one.